Hey everybody, I'm Mike Levy. I'm a technical editor at Pinkbike, and I'm here with a new video series called The Explainer, where I'm going to explain all sorts of useless bike dork info. Now it's going to be great, maybe, and we're going to talk about all sorts of things. Why the hell do we have more than one seat post size? What's with all these different bottom brackets? What are those little rubber hairs on your tires? Those are super weird. So assuming that Pinkbike doesn't fire me next week, I'm going to be here fairly often to unfold the basic to the baffling. What's the deal with linkage forks? Why won't they just go away? New standards! Suspension forks, whether they're telescoping like this here Lyric, or linkaging like this here Trust fork, let us ride faster, in more control, and in more comfort. Now they do this by keeping your tire in contact with the ground, which gives you traction, and absorbing all the bumps, and fixing all your shitty line choices. Now, no matter what they look like, they'll have a spring on one side and usually a damper on the other side. The spring takes in the impact and the damper absorbs it. That's true of this telescoping fork and it's true of this linkage fork. Speaking of what they look like, in this hand is a RockShox Lyric. Now, like a lot of other forks out there, you're looking at two stanchion tubes, you got your lowers, you got an axle, you have a crown and a steer tube. The stanchion tubes slide in and out on some very carefully sized bushings. It's been this basic design for, get this, 110 years. So I'm gonna have to ask RC what those early forks were like to ride, but this is where we're at now. And you know what? They work pretty dang well. Now let's get kooky. This here is a linkage fork, and it does the same job as a telescoping suspension fork, but it does it very differently. Instead of stanchions that slide in and out on bushings into fork lowers, like it does on your telescoping fork, it uses a linkage to deliver its suspension travel. You know how most full suspension bikes have some sort of linkage for the rear suspension? Same idea, but on the front of your bike. All of the pivots on your full suspension bike, they've been very carefully placed down to the millimeter so that the rear suspension performs how the designer intended it to. And the same thing could be applied here again. These pivots can be placed exactly where they need them, down to the millimeter, to have this linkage perform how the designer wants it to. And that's really the advantage of a linkage fork. So when we talk about suspension, we can also talk about ratio. And a suspension fork, a telescoping suspension fork, like the one you probably have on the front of your bike, it has a 1-to-1 ratio. And that means that this here axle moves 1 inch, the damper and the spring also move 1 inch. 1-to-1, pretty simple. But this linkage fork is like your rear suspension. The rear suspension could have a 3-to-1 ratio, it could be 10-to-1. That probably wouldn't work very well, but they could make it work like that by changing the locations of the pivots. And this front suspension fork can do the same thing. Basically, it can be boiled down to a linkage fork can be made to do things that a telescoping fork isn't able to do. Picture yourself at the top of Dead Man's Hill. We all have our own Dead Man's Hill. Anyways, so you're going down the hill and it's really steep, you're really scared, you're on the brakes really hard, and your fork is almost bottomed. It's way down in its travel because your weight is shifting forward because Dead Man's Hill is really steep. Now, to keep the fork up in its travel, so you have some suspension left to absorb bumps, it uses things like low speed damping or low speed compression damping, higher spring rates. So it's using the spring and the damper to hold the fork up. That's not ideal because the spring and damper's main job is to absorb bumps, not hold my fat ass up when I'm going down the hill. This linkage fork, on the other hand, they can be designed so that the geometry of the linkage is what holds you up instead of the spring and the damper. Now theoretically, that would mean that you can have more suspension travel to do things that it's supposed to do, like absorb bumps. Let's talk about bushings versus bearings. This telescoping fork, well, all telescoping forks, the stanchions slide in and out of the lowers on bushings. Now the bushings, there's usually a few of them, and they're usually made from some sort of bronze or steel, aluminum. They have some science sprinkled on them and some Teflon. The idea is that they're as slippery as possible so that your fork is active as possible. The tolerances are like 1/1000th of an inch. That's like, see the space between my fingers? That's that much. So if they're too tight or too loose, you'll have a fork that doesn't move freely, or you'll have a fork that does that super weird knocking thing. It always feels like your headset's loose, but it's actually your bushings that are worn out, and it's super annoying. But generally, this basic layout, it works pretty well. Now, linkage forks, on the other hand, obviously there's no stanchions, there's no lowers, there's no bushings as we think about them in this fork anyway. Linkage forks will usually use sealed bearings at each pivots, and the idea is that that should make them more active, smoother, supple, all of those cliche terms than something like this, because there's less friction in bearings than there is in bushings. Now, it's all sounding pretty rosy for linkage forks, isn't it? And I might sound like I'm on Team Linkage Fork, but I'm not. They're pretty neat, but they do have some drawbacks. And one of them is the complication. If you look at this, there's a lot of pivots here. And anybody who's had a full suspension bike that eats pivots, you know that pivots can be a huge pain in the ass. Now, that's not true of this fork necessarily. I've had this testing now for, about a month, and it's been trouble-free. But generally, that complication, we're scared of it because we're mountain bikers. Another thing that us mountain bikers are always worried about is weight. How many grams is this? How many grams is that? Is this 5 grams less? How many rotor bolts are you running? Take your valve caps off, save grams. Well, for those kinds of people, a linkage fork might not ever be the fork. Because of all the sealed bearings and some other stuff, they are generally a little bit heavier than a telescoping fork of similar intentions in travel. Linkage forks generally use some sort of unproven spring and damper setup. Now, when you're spending a load of money on a new suspension fork, $1,000 or more, are you gonna want something that looks neat and is cool, or are you gonna want something that's proven? If you bought 100 suspension forks on the market right now, high-end ones, I bet you 98, 99, maybe 100 of them will work perfectly for a good amount of time. Linkage forks, on the other hand, they're kind of like a great unknown. They look neat, but they're weird. Now, sure, they've been around on everything from Grand Prix racing motorbikes to folding bikes to mountain bikes over the years. Shout out to the Girvin, to the Amp. But you know what they all have in common? They've all been dead ends. Now, a big reason that you don't really see linkage forks out in the wild isn't because they don't work well. It's simply because the market belongs to the first adopters who went all in, and these days, they're making some pretty good stuff. Today's suspension forks, like I said earlier, they work really, really well. So why would you take the chance on something like this? Something weird. I don't think you're ever gonna see Fox or RockShox making these things, and for the most part, it's gonna be left to the smaller people, the companies like Trust, and all the other little guys out there who are thinking out of the box, doing different things. So what do you guys think? If you had to go out tomorrow and buy a new fork, and you could choose between a linkage fork and a similarly priced telescoping fork, are you gonna pick that linkage fork, or are you gonna pick what you know? Are you gonna pick the 34, the 36, the Lyric, the Pike, the DVO, the Suntour, whatever, or are you gonna go for something weird? Let us know in the comments what you would choose.